So welcome everybody to the first lecture from the Rising Tide Foundation of 2022. And I'm really happy that we could all start and be here today on a Sunday. We've got a lot in store over the coming 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 months of lectures as part of this new symposium that Cynthia had in mind to sort of just start the new year off on the right foot. We've been through a lot of universal history. We've had symposiums on science, the suppression of real scientific discoveries. We've had lectures on the poetic principle throughout history. And we wanted to really just focus on the question of what is universal history. This has obviously been a theme we've been working with for a very long time. We've been dovetailing it and touching upon it in different ways. But rather than seeing history as just a bunch of trivial facts that you memorize and then you write about, or maybe you spin and give your commentary about based on whatever ideology that you happen to adhere to, rather than do it that way, we're taking the view that there is such a thing as truth. It's not just about personal subjective spin or interpretation that defines what is history. There is a higher universal quality to history as it happened and as it is being made currently, since everything from even pre-written history to the future that doesn't exist yet, it is all part of one human experience within the context of the universe that existed beyond and above the domain where human beings interact, where we live, where we were created. And while other animals, we know from fossil records, however one chooses to interpret them, that there is, the vast majority of species that have ever come into being no longer exist. 99.99, I don't know what it is, but most species have a certain ephemeral quality to them. They were part of a process of creative evolution. They came into being, they operated for a period, something happened, disasters happened, earthquakes, asteroids, solar flares, ice ages. Like there's a variety of things that we've increasingly discovered are periodically hammering the solar system, the galaxy, the Earth within that context. And within that entire process of directed flow of life in a material fashion, there has been the appearance of this particular species that we happen to be members of, which have a lot of the similar attributes to other species. DNA-wise, we're not that different from higher apes, and we're physically bounded, we're individually limited in space and time, we're born, we're going to die. But there is no actual evidence that the human being as a species will go extinct. As far as we know, that's not been proven. We are in fact, by virtue of the fact that we can overcome our carrying capacities and we can use this metaphysical quality of creative mentation to leap into new discovery concepts and translate them in the form of new technologies. We can do what no other animal species can do. Right? And we can sustain more of us at a higher quality of life. And this is wonderful, but it's not just scientifically, and it's also in the form of the stories that we tell, that give meaning, right? That infuse an idea of what the higher meaning and purpose and causality is of our life. And it's taken the form of stories of gods and in ancient times in Greece and in Egypt, in Asia. Every culture has their stories, and their poets and prophets have wrapped their ideas of moral, ethical principles in story-like form, and this is wonderful. It's a part of what makes us human. So, following the precepts and ideas of Friedrich Schiller and many universal historians, but especially Friedrich Schiller, we thought it would be nice to theme this current symposium myth making, storytelling, and universal history to just explore this from different periods in time, different cultural matrices, to see how this expresses itself and what can we get by looking at the great authors of different periods from this vantage point. What insight can we get into human nature and what is this all about? So for the first presentation, I'm very happy that that Jerry will be the first to kick off this new year with something on Homer, which I don't know anything about. I'm very excited to learn a bunch of new things, and Madeline will be his guide and partner in this story that we're about to be told. So Jerry, thank you. Go for it.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, and thanks, Cynthia. Before I start, I just want to apologize for my Greek pronunciation, because there's ancient Greek pronunciation, which I don't know. There's modern Greek pronunciation, which I don't know. And then there's the Latin translation of it. For example, I'll be talking about the Odyssey, and the hero in it is Odysseus. The Latin translation of Odysseus is Ulysses, like Ulysses Grant. So that's what most people have heard. So I usually just say a Greek word or a place or a name just based on the way I heard someone else say it. So my translations are all over the place. So if my Greek is wrong, don't worry about it. I think you'll understand anyway. It's not big. So I'm just going to do a screen share. I hope everybody can see that.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. All right. So rediscovering the Odyssey of Homer. Was it history or was it a myth? That's what I'll be discussing. So one way of looking at Homer is shown by the painting here, Rembrandt's painting of Virgil contemplating the bust of Homer. Virgil vainly trying to figure out how Homer was able to compose his poem. Now, in the painting, Rembrandt has the light shining on the bust of Homer. That's Homer here. In such a way, it actually looks like the light is coming from Homer and shining outwards. And then he has Virgil. This is Virgil here. Now, Virgil has placed one hand on Homer's head, seeing if he can figure it out, but his other hand is holding his nice shiny gold chains. So Rembrandt is contrasting Homer, who is Plato's aristocratic man who is motivated by discovery and creativity. That's what Plato means by aristocratic. Against Virgil, who is Plato's timocratic man who is motivated by power and the appearance of honor. And Rembrandt so poetically shows this conflict in Virgil with one hand on Homer, but the other hand on his gold. Now, another way of looking at Homer is seen in a poem written by John Keats on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Now, George Chapman published the first English translation of Homer. So this is a poem Keats wrote about that. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So in this poem, Keats writes about his excitement on reading and discovering the wonder of Homer's Odyssey. Now, some people believe that Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were not true history, but were simply myths that he concocted, just like Virgil concocted his myth of the Aeneid. But that was until a man named Heinrich Schliemann discovered the ruins of Troy in the 1870s, which changed people's minds completely because it proved that the Iliad and the Trojan War did happen. But what about Homer's other poem, the Odyssey? Was that one based on true events, or was it just a fable? Now, some of you may have read Homer and some may not. So first, I'll start with who was Homer. So according to Herodotus, who wrote The Life of Homer, there's just a copy of it there. Melissengenes, that was his real name. Melissengenes, a teacher at Smyrna, right there, Smyrna, in Ionia. He decided to join Mentes, who was a ship owner, to visit different places. He wanted to see the world while he was still young, right? Now, on one trip, on their way back from Spain and Etruria, this is Spain here, and Etruria is here, that's like northern Italy. On their way back, Melissengenes became very ill with an eye disease. And so Mentes left him at Ithaca, right here. This is island Ithaca. And he left him at the home of a friend of his, Mentor. And while recuperating, Melissengenes researched and learned the story of Odysseus. Now later, he rejoined Mentes to sail with him until his eye disease returned. But this time, he didn't recover and he became blind. Now, just an aside, in the Odyssey, Homer repays his two friends. He has Athena take the disguise of Mentes in book 1, and she takes the guise of Mentor in book 2. So he's already changing history a little bit, but that was his repayment to his friends. Now, after he became blind, Melissengenes returned home to Smyrna, back here. And he decided to try his hand at poetry. Excuse me. And later he decided to go to Sima, right here, little town north of there, and asked the city if they would support him at public expense, then he would bring great glory to the city with his poetry. However, they decided that if they would support all of the Homeroi is what the Samaeans called the blind. If they supported all the Homeroi, then the city would have this large and useless multitude. So they didn't help him. But that name Homeroi stuck with Melissengenes. And from then on, he was called Homer. So he traveled and he performed his verses in salons in different cities. And eventually he arrived in Chios. That's this island right here. And there he set up a school and he settled down. He got married. They had 2 daughters. And it is here that he most likely composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, some people believe that in the poem, The Odyssey, Odysseus merely traveled around the Aegean Sea here, right? Close to home, close to the places where Homer grew up. While some people believed that he sailed to Canada. So here's a newspaper clipping that I kept from 2010. It's of a retired engineer from Nova Scotia who had the idea that the tides and whirlpools found at the Bay of Fundy actually describe a place, Charybdis, in Homer's Odyssey. So I guess he's writing a book about this. It's interesting, and it opens up possibilities to think about. But did Homer know about the Americas? I mean, Plato talks about the American continent in his Timaeus dialogue, but what did Homer know about the world? Had he known of maps showing the extent of the world? And I just want to add here, for more about this, if people haven't already seen it, they should watch Stephen's lecture on the importance of Hapgood's map of the ancient sea kings and why the study of ancient history must be reformed. It's an excellent presentation. People, if you haven't already watched it, you should, because it goes into this more. So I just want to look at one possible representation of a map of the Mediterranean world and try to imagine the different parts of Asia, Europe, and Africa as they may have appeared at the time of Homer. Okay, first, Asia. Now, according to Herodotus, Herodotus lived 485 to 425 BC. He was slightly older than Socrates, to give you an idea. And he wrote a history book. And according to him, Asia began south of the Caucasus Mountains along the eastern shore of the Euxine Sea. Now, there's the Caucasus Mountains. And the Euxine Sea, we call it the Black Sea. So Asia begins here, along the east coast of the Black Sea, along Anatolia, we call it Turkey. Herodotus says there was 30 different nations in Anatolia, quite developed. And then Phoenicia, Syria, Palestine, all the way to Egypt. And then along the Erythraean Sea, we call it the Red Sea, along here, encompassing Arabia, Assyria, and Persia, all the way to India. And for Herodotus, he says, beyond which country, eastward, all is desert, the extent of which is known to no man. So to the Greeks at this time, they didn't know anything past India. But you get an idea what, when he says Asia, that's what he means. Okay, second, Europe. According to Herodotus, same person, Europe reached as far as both Asia and Libya. So Europe joined Asia to Libya. And it began north of the Caucasus Mountains along the western shore of the Black Sea. Now, this is where we get this weird term, Caucasian. We're called Caucasian because we're from people north of the Caucasus. Why they couldn't call Caucasians people south of the Caucasus, I don't know, but that's where that weird thing comes from. So it's the west side of the Black Sea. It encompasses all of Greece and all along until what's called the Pillars of Hercules. We call it Gibraltar. And for Herodotus, no one has discovered whether on the north and on the east it is surrounded by the sea. So he says he doesn't know Europe outside of Gibraltar. However, there were stories about Jason and the Argonauts. And according to Diodorus Siculus, he lived in the 1st century BC. He was a contemporary of Cicero. In his history, he wrote this. Where's my reader?
Unmute. Okay.
There you go.
Not a few, both of the ancient historians and of the later ones as well, say that the Argonauts, after the seizure of the fleece, learning that the mouth of the Pontus, Black Sea, had already been blockaded by the fleets of Aeetes, performed an amazing exploit, which is worthy of mention. They sailed, that is to say, up the Tanais River, the Don River, as far as its sources. And at a certain place, they hauled the ship overland. And following in turn another river, which flows into the ocean, they sailed down it to the sea.
To there.
Then they made their course from the north to the west, keeping the land on the left. And when they had arrived near Gadara, Cadiz,
Right there.
they sailed into our sea, the Mediterranean Sea.
So if we believe that the story of Jason and the Argonauts contained a certain amount of historical truth to its story, then we would think that Jason had circumnavigated Europe. Okay, third, Libya. We know it today as Africa. It was called Libya. So Libya began at the Nile River in Egypt, right here, and encompassed all those lands along the Northern Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, as far as the Pillars of Hercules and beyond. And then along the Southern Sea, all the way back to Egypt. Now, the Southern Sea would indicate a knowledge of the entire continent of Libya. How did Herodotus know that Libya was circumnavigable? In his history, Herodotus tells the story of King Neko, who ruled Egypt from 610 BC to 595 BC. He had started to build a canal from the Nile River over to the Red Sea, but he got partway done and he stopped because of some oracle that scared him. So instead, he constructed a bunch of galleys, ships. Some of the galleys were for the Northern Sea, the Mediterranean, and some of the galleys, the ships, were for the Erythraean Sea, the Red Sea. And these southern ships he sent to circumnavigate Libya. And Herodotus wrote this.
Libya declares itself to be circumnavigable, except where it is bounded by Asia. The first person known to have proved this was Neko, king of Egypt. When he ceased to carry on the canal leading from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, he sent out some Phoenicians, instructing them to sail around by the Pillars of Hercules to the Northern Sea, and so return to Egypt. These Phoenicians, therefore, parting from the Erythraean Sea, navigated the Southern Sea. When autumn arrived, they drew to shore on that part of Libya opposite to which they might be. There they sowed the ground and awaited the harvest, which when they had reaped, they again set sail. Thus they continued their progress during 2 years. In the third, doubling the Pillars of Hercules, they arrived in Egypt. These persons affirmed what to me seems incredible, though it meant it to another, that as they sailed round Libya, they had the sun rising on the right hand. In this way was Libya made known.
So if we believe Herodotus about King Neko, then they did it. And it took them 3 years. Now, Neko doesn't seem to be the type of ruler who would just all of a sudden send ships to sail around Libya into the great unknown, hoping to eventually return to Egypt, unless it was already known that it was possible. Now, I say this because a similar project that was started by Henry the Navigator of Portugal in 1415 took over 80 years before da Gama was able to sail from Portugal all the way around Africa and reach India in 1498. This was like an Apollo project of its day that also led to Columbus rediscovering the route to the Americas in 1492. So perhaps it had been possible for Homer to have heard some tales or stories about all these voyages of discovery, and for the Odyssey to contain some of these tales of discovery. Perhaps it may be possible that it was just a tale, that it was meant to show us the changing character that Odysseus needed to lead such a voyage of discovery. Or, as I will try to show, that it's both. And Homer's method, it's the way that Strabo describes Homer. According to Strabo, who lived 64 BC to 24 AD, in his geography, he writes this.
Thus it is that our poet, though he sometimes employs fiction for the purposes of instruction, always gives the preference to truth. He makes use of what is false, merely tolerating it in order the more easily to lead and govern the multitude. As a man binds with a golden verge bright silver, so Homer, heightening by fictional actual occurrences, adorns and embellishes his subject. But his end is always the same as that of the historian, who relates nothing but facts. In this manner, he undertook the narration of the Trojan War, gilding it with the beauties of fancy and the wanderings of Odysseys. But we shall never find Homer inventing an empty fable apart from the inculcation of truth.
I really like that quote describing Homer's method. Now, one example, this is my favorite example. Instead of saying the next morning, Homer would say, and then came rosy-fingered dawn. And he says this so many times in the Odyssey, rosy-fingered dawn. And so he uses fancy, his imagination, to draw a picture of something beautiful in our mind that we can think about. So now we're going to look at Homer's Odyssey the way Strabo says, that Homer took actual events, heightened them with fiction, and gilded them with the beauties of fancy, but never without the stamp of truth. Now, the Odyssey is really a story within a story. There is the outer story of Odysseus returning home after 10 years of the Trojan War and finding his family and home under an invasion and destruction caused by the many suitors who wished to take over his kingdom. And within this, there is an inner story of another 10 years of wanderings of Odysseus trying to reach home. So we're going to look at this inner story of his wanderings, his Odyssey. So at the end of the war, the end of the Trojan War, Odysseus, his men, and his 12 ships finally left Troy and traveled to Ismaros. You can see here, there's Troy, and they just traveled here, not far, to Ismaros, where they sacked the town, killed its men, took their wives in possession, and divided the loot equally among themselves. The people, the Cicones, called together all their neighbors, and the next morning they attacked Odysseus and his men and forced them to flee. So following 10 years of a devastating war, the first thing that Odysseus and his men do on their return home is to sack and pillage a town? What is wrong with these people, you might ask? Hadn't they learned anything about war? Or after 10 years of war, maybe they think that's the way the world is. It's motivated by power. So Homer here is showing us how Odysseus and his companions were thinking at the start of the Odyssey. And because of their actions, their destinies would be punished by an evil fate of Zeus. But before we blame all this on Zeus, he's always getting the bad shift. Let's hear what Zeus has to say about all this. So at a meeting of the gods, Zeus says this.
Well now, how indeed mortal men do blame the gods. They say it is from us evils come. Yet they themselves, by their own recklessness, have pains beyond their lot.
So perhaps instead of being a punishment, Zeus was steering them onto a path for changing their way of thinking, right? Okay, so Zeus raised a north wind. And I just want to mention north wind will come up again in this presentation. So remember, to change their way of thinking, he sent a north wind and he sent an immense storm against them. And as they were rounding Malia, that's right here, it's the southernmost point of Greece. See, they wanted to go here and to Ithaca, home. But instead, as they were rounding here, they were driven by destructive winds away from their return to Ithaca. And after 9 days, they reached the land of the Lotus Eaters. Now, as you can see, I put Lotus Eaters here in Libya. So we can assume that the Lotus Eaters lived along the coast of Libya because according to Herodotus, in his book, he was describing all the inhabitants who lived along the coast here of Libya. And about the Lotus Eaters, he wrote this.
The projecting coast in front of the Gendanes is possessed by the Lotophages, who, as the name indicates, subsist upon the fruits of the lotus. This fruit is nearly equal in size to that of the mastic, and in sweetness resembles the date. The Lotophages prepare a wine from it.
Okay, so that's why I've put the Lotus Eaters here. Also, just as an aside, you'll notice Cyrene. The Greek colony of Cyrene on the coast of Libya was founded in 631 BC. That's like 200-300 years after Homer. So Homer didn't know about this, but just give you an idea. Okay, so after landing the land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus sent 3 of his companions to find out who these people were. The Lotus Eaters gave the 3 men some lotus fruit to eat. But when the 3 men ate the lotus fruit, they didn't want to bring back any word to Odysseus. They just wanted to stay there and eat more lotus fruit, not even to think about returning to Ithaca. So Odysseus had to force his 3 weeping companions back to the ship, dragging them and binding them under the benches. And then he called the rest of his men back to the ship in case someone else ate the lotus fruit and forgot about returning. So they fled from the Lotus Eaters and sailed away to reach the land of the Cyclops. So they sailed from here, and I've put the land of the Cyclops here, Sicily. Now, we can assume that the Cyclops lived in Sicily and that Odysseus had sailed across the strait from the land of the Lotus Eaters to the land of the one-eyed Cyclops near the great one-eyed volcano, Mount Etna in Sicily. Because according to Thucydides, who lived from 460 BC to 400 BC, he was a contemporary of Socrates. In book 4 of his book, The Peloponnesian War, where he's discussing an expedition of the Athenians against Sicily, and he's talking about Sicily, he wrote this.
The Cyclops and Lestrigons are said to be the most ancient inhabitants of some part of this country. But from what stock they were derived, or from whence they came hither, or what is become of them since, I have nothing to relate. Poetical amusements must here suffice, or such information as every man picks up for his own use.
So that's why I'm going with Thucydides. That's why I put Cyclops in Sicily. And just as an aside, excuse me, the Greek colony of Syracuse, right there, the black dot, would be founded in 733 BC. That was 100, 200 years after Homer. Now, the Cyclops, they were an uncivilized people who, quote, do not sow plants with their hands and do not plow, but everything grows for them unplowed and unsown. They have neither assemblies for holding council nor laws, unquote. So after landing, Odysseus took 12 of his companions with him, and they went to inquire about the inhabitants to see whether they are proud and savage and without justice, or whether they are friendly to strangers and have a God-fearing mind. So they found a cave, the unattended cave of Polyphemus, who was the giant Cyclops and the son of Poseidon, and they entered the cave. Now, his men, they wished to just grab some of the cheeses and grab some of the sheep and run back to the ship and sail away. But Odysseus wished instead to say and received a gift from Polyphemus. It was the custom at that time for hosts to give gifts to the guests. But pitiless Polyphemus wanted none of that. He trapped them in his cave, and he ate 6 of them before Odysseus finally devised a plan to blind the eye of the Cyclops and then hide under the bellies of the sheep and make their escape and get back to their ships. So after finally escaping from the Cyclops, Odysseus and his companions sailed to the island of Aeolia. Now, I've put Aeolia, one of these islands, here. So we can assume that Aeolia was one of the volcanic islands of Lipari, they're called today Lipari, lying off Sicily's northeastern coast, and that Odysseus had sailed from the land of the Cyclops around the coast of Sicily to the island of Aeolia. Because, according to Strabo, in his book, Geography, he wrote this.
Homer's narrative is founded on history. He tells us that King Aeolus governed the Lipari Islands, that around Mount Etna and Leontini dwelt the Cyclopi, and certain Laestrogonians inhospitable to strangers.
So that's why I put Aeolia there. Also, as an aside, a Greek colony at Lipara would be founded in 580 BC. So Odysseus and his men stayed at Aeolia with the king, Aeolus, who was the lord of the winds. And they stayed there for a whole month as his guests before deciding they wanted to leave. Now, to help them, Aeolus gave Odysseus an oxide. Inside of the oxide, he had bound up all 4 of the blustering winds so that they would not blow at all. And then he set a gentle breeze to carry them and their ships home to Ithaca, right? To just go there. And after 10 days, they actually could finally see their homeland. They were almost home, but because of the foolishness and the greed of the men who wanted to see how much gold and silver Aeolus had given to Odysseus, while Odysseus was asleep, they opened the oxide, and all the winds rushed out, and a storm carried them all the way back to Aeolia. So the men do not seem to have learned anything or have changed at all since their actions at Ismaros, when Zeus sent the north wind to change their destiny. Back at Aeolia, King Aeolus, he would not help them anymore since he thought they must be despised by the gods, and he sent them away. And so they sailed to the land of the giant Lestrygonians. So I've put the Lestrygonians here on Sardinia. And we can assume that the Lestrygonians lived on Sardinia and that Odysseus had sailed from Aeolia, one of the Lipari Islands, to the land of the Lestrygonians on Sardinia because of the Neragic statues. Now, some historians relate that the legend of the giants may be the result of Greek sightings of these ancient stone sculptures of the Neragic culture. And these are some that were found at Monte Prama at Sardinia. And some of them are 8 feet tall. So you can imagine if these statues were lined up along the coast of the island and you were sailing by, you might think there was giants living there. So leaving Aeolia, Odysseus and his companions sailed for 6 days until they arrived at the land of the giant Lestrygonians. Odysseus sent 3 men to see who lived there. And the 3 men found the glorious hall of the king, who was not happy to see them, however, but was planning a woeful destruction for them. And then the king snatched one of them and made a meal of him, as the other 2 rushed back to the ships. But the 2 men were followed by the giants, who attacked all the men and all the ships. And Homer says this about it.
Thousands of them, like giants and not like men. From the cliffs they threw boulders the size of a man's load, and at once an evil din rose up among the ships, of men being destroyed and the ships being crushed together. Spearing the men like fish, they bore off their gruesome meal.
So only Odysseus and his lone ship's companions were able to escape the destruction, since they had tied up their ship outside of the harbor. But all the other men and all the other ships were lost. After fleeing from the giants, Odysseus's ship landed at the island of Aea, the home of the goddess Circe. So I put Aea here at the Isle of Elba. And we can assume that Aea is the Isle of Elba because according to Apollonius lived 295 BC to 215 BC in Alexandria in Egypt. And he wrote a poem, Argonautica, about Jason and the Argonauts. And in the poem, Jason landed first at Aethalia, and from there, he made it to Aea. And this is what he wrote about it. And remember, we had talked about Jason circumnavigating Europe and coming into the Mediterranean here through the Straits of Gibraltar. So this is what he wrote about that.
So they sailed through the river's midmost mouth at Gibraltar and came onto the line of islands. After leaving the line of islands, they sailed to the Isle of Aethalia. Quickly, they sailed thence across the ocean swell, with their eyes upon the Tyrrhenian Etruscan cliffs of Ausonia, and came onto the famous harbor of Aea. There, they found Circe washing her head in the seawater.
So after Jason had circumnavigated Europe and entered the Mediterranean, he sailed past the line of islands to Aethalia, and which we assume to be Corsica, and then towards the Etruscan shore to Aea, that we assume to be Elba. So that's why I've put them there. Now, just as a note, the Greek colony of Alalia which is right here on Corsica, was founded in 565 BC, and the Greek colony of Massalia here, today's Marseille, was founded by the Greeks in 600 BC. So both of these are like 200-300 years after Homer. So they're here on the island of Aiaia. Now, Odysseus's men, remembering the Cyclops and the giant Laestrygonians, were fearful of searching the island for any inhabitants. So they drew lots to see who was going to go. Eurylochus led forth 22 men, and they went, searched the island, and they found the hall of Circe, who invited the men into her hall to eat and drink. But she stirred a drug into their food that turned them into swine. Now, with the help of Hermes, who made Odysseus immune to Circe's drugs, Odysseus was able to go and free his companions, and they were turned back into men. And Circe invited them back into her hall to eat and drink, but without any drugs this time. Quote, "Until you have taken the spirit into your breast again, as it was when you first left your fatherland." In other words, before the Trojan War started, when they were leaving to go to war. Return to that kind of thinking. So they stayed for a whole year at Aiaia with Circe until they finally decided they wanted to go home. When Odysseus asked Circe to show them how to return, Circe wouldn't tell them how, but she said that they must enter Hades. He gives a whole description of how to get to Hades. I'm not going to go into that here, but Hades is where our souls go after we die, according to the Greeks. And when they get to Hades, they should ask this of the soul of Tiresias. Tiresias was a blind prophet who had possessed the gift of foresight. Now, foresight, that's not predicting the future with a crystal ball. Foresight is foreseeing where the course of events will lead. So it's interesting because, here you have the blind poet Homer telling Odysseus that he has to go seek the advice of the blind prophet Tiresias. So it's kind of funny. So Circe gave instructions to Odysseus about how to prepare a sacrifice for the dead and how to journey to Hades. She said, don't worry about a guide, just stretch out your sails and let the north wind bring you there. Remember earlier, Homer used this metaphor of the north wind sent by Zeus that had started Odysseus on his voyage. So the north wind again will lead them to Hades. After arriving at Hades, Odysseus followed the instructions of Circe, prepared a sacrifice, and then was able to meet the soul of Tiresias. And Tiresias told Odysseus that first, he's going to have a disastrous return because of Poseidon, because he had blinded Poseidon's son, the Cyclops. So Tiresias says this:
I do not think you will elude the earth shaker. Against you he has laid up a grudge. In his heart, enraged that you blinded his beloved son. You may get there yet, even so, though you suffer ills, if you are willing to check your spirit and your companions.
So Tiresias was forecasting that if you check your spirits, that you might get home. That's his foresight. Okay, secondly, he spoke about the sheep and cattle of Hyperion. Hyperion is the god of the sun.
If you let them go unmolested and think of your return, you may yet get to Ithaca, though you do suffer ills. If you molest them, Then I prophesy destruction for your ship and companions.
So Tiresias forecasts that if you leave Hyperion's animals unmolested, that you might reach home. Now, thirdly, he spoke of making a sacrifice to Poseidon.
And carry out fine sacrifices to Lord Poseidon, a ram, a bull, and a boar, the mounter of Zeus. Then go back home and sacrifice sacred hecatombs to the immortal gods who possess broad heaven, to all of them in order.
So Tiresias forecasts that if you finally do reach home, how you would offer a sacrifice to Poseidon and the gods. Tiresias then showed Odysseus how he could speak with other souls of the dead. So Odysseus met the soul of his mother, Anticlea, and they spoke about his family. Odysseus next met the soul of Agamemnon, who told him of how he was killed by his cursed wife. And he asked Odysseus if he had any news of his son, but Odysseus had none. Odysseus then met the soul of Achilles, who asked about his son. And Odysseus spoke of his son's courage at Troy. After that, Odysseus also saw the difficult pains of three other souls, of Tityos, who was being punished by having his liver eaten out by 2 vultures each day while it grew back each night, and of Tantalos, who was being punished by standing in a lake beneath fruit trees. But the lake would dry up when he tried to drink, and the wind would blow away the fruit whenever he tried to pick any. And of Sisyphus, who was punished by rolling a monstrous stone to the crest of a hill before it would roll back, only to have to push it back up again. I think a lot of people know that story of Sisyphus. And then, not wanting to stay any longer, Odysseus called his men back to the ship, and they sailed away from Hades. Now, perhaps this idea of having to go to Hades is to reminisce with those who have died, those who are relatives or dear friends or companions, in making your fateful decisions, or to see the punishment of others who did not have good intentions in their fateful decisions. But Odysseus didn't talk to them. His bold spirit talked to their souls, which is important to see that distinction. And perhaps this metaphor of going to Hades is trying to indicate that if you wish to discover new worlds, you have to have a bold spirit. You have to have the courage to be willing to face the great unknown in order to get there. So Odysseus and his companions returned to the island of Aea, where they rested. While they were here, Circe took Odysseus aside, away from his companions. And again, she did not tell Odysseus how to return home, but told him how to escape from the next challenges he was to face. First, the Sirens, and then Scylla and Charybdis. So Odysseus told his companions that Circe had said that they must not listen to the voices of the Sirens. These are the Sirens here, the 6 Sirens. Or if they listen to the voices, they'll become enchanted and just want to stay there in the meadow full of flowers and never leave until their bodies had rotted away. So Odysseus took softened wax and smeared it into the ears of all his companions so they would not hear the singing. Odysseus alone was allowed to hear their song, but he ordered his men to bind him hand and foot to the mast. You see him here, tied up, so that he he would so they wouldn't be able to escape the sirens. So he could hear them, but he wouldn't be able to be enchanted. So this way they were able to escape the sirens. But what was it that the sirens sang that so enchanted Odysseus?
Come near, much praised Odysseus, the Achaeans' great glory. Bring your ship in so you may listen to our voice. No one ever yet sped past this place in a black ship before he listened to the honey-toned voice from our mouths. And then he went off delighted at knowing more things. For we know all the many things that in broad Troy the Argives and the Trojans suffered at the will of the gods. We know all that comes to be on the much nourishing earth.
So the Sirens tempted him with flattery and sang that they could predict his future, which was different from the forecast of Tiresias, right? But Odysseus, being tied up, was able to check his spirit, and his companions, unable to hear them, were able to sail past the Sirens towards Scylla and Charybdis. Now, Circe had told Odysseus that if his companions got past the Sirens, that at this point she couldn't tell him which of two ways he should take. He himself must decide in his heart. One way was by the wandering rocks, where all ships were destroyed by sea waves and storms of destructive fire that tried to pass that way. Now, the other way was by two crags, Scylla, there's Scylla, and there's Charybdis. On the first crag lives Scylla, who has 6 very long necks, each neck with a terrible head, each head having 3 rows of teeth. And from every ship that tries to pass, she will snatch a mortal from that passing ship with each of her 6 heads. Now, on the second crag lives Charybdis, who 3 times a day will suck back the water terribly, and 3 times a day will send it back. But if you are there when she sucks the water up or sends it back, nothing can save you from evil. So Circe told Odysseus to sail by the crag of Scylla. Quote, since it is better by far to miss 6 companions than everyone at once. Now, Odysseus urged his men to row hard against the waves, and he urged the pilot to steer towards the crag of Scylla. He made his mind up. But he didn't tell them any more than that, fearing that if he did, in their fear of what would happen, they'd cease rowing. So they were able to escape past the 2 crags, but were helpless, as Scylla snatched away and ate 6 of the men. Odysseus says, the most piteous thing I saw with my eyes of all that I suffered as I sought out the pass of the sea. And they sailed to the island of Thrinacia, where the god Hyperion kept his beautiful herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. So, well, metaphorically, sailing past the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis was like venturing out into the vast unknown. Now, if we assume that sailing past the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis was, was sailing past the Pillars of Hercules, then Odysseus must have sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I drew this part of the journey from Aea to Thrinacia with a dotted line, because this is where there is so much controversy, as some people simply refuse to admit that Odysseus could have sailed out into the ocean. But remember earlier in the life of Homer, Herodotus wrote that young Homer had sailed to Spain. So if he went to Spain, he would have gone to the main port here, which we call Cadiz, Gadira. So he would have sailed through the Pillars of Hercules. No big deal. And we also saw earlier how Jason had circumnavigated Europe and King Neko had circumnavigated Africa, and they both went past the Pillars of Hercules into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, there's another funny little story. According to an Arabic explorer who landed on an island in the Atlantic near Morocco that was inhabited by wild sheep, he warned them that they were not good to eat. So, remembering that Tiresias had warned Odysseus not to eat any of the cattle or sheep, we can assume that Thrinakia is one of the Madeira Islands. Now, as they got near Thrinakia, Odysseus remembered this warning he received from Tiresias, and he told his companions that a terrible evil would happen to him there, and he wanted to just sail on past the island, not to stop. But his companions said they were worn out with fatigue and sleepiness, and they were afraid that a storm might come up during the night and destroy the ship. And so they wanted to just stay one night on the island, and then they'd leave first thing in the morning. So Odysseus agreed, but he made them swear an oath not to slaughter any of the cows or sheep. But that night, a storm arose, and the wind blew steadily for a whole month, keeping them stuck on the island until their provisions from the ship were all gone. While Odysseus was gone away for his companions to go pray to the gods to show him the way to leave and get home, the men unfolded a very bad plan to kill some of Hyperion's cattle. This was their plan.
There are all kinds of hateful deaths for wretched mortals, but most piteous is to die and meet one's fate by hunger. But if he is at all enraged for his straight-horned cattle and wishes to destroy the ship and the other gods follow, I would rather gasp once into a wave and lose my life than to be starved a long time on a desert island.
Not trying to come up with some kind of a way out, the men listened to their despair instead of relying on hope, and they made that bad decision. They slaughtered the cattle, both to make a sacrifice, but also to prepare a meal. All to Odysseus's horror when he returned back. So when the storm finally ceased, they quickly boarded the ship and they fled Thrinakia. Now, to me, the story of Thrinakia unfortunately shows that Odysseus never reached America. He never reached Nova Scotia. Sorry to our Canadian friends in Nova Scotia. If you read The Life of Christopher Columbus by Washington Irving, and about how Columbus used to keep two sets of books, one true set for himself that he kept locked up, and another false set that he used to show his men that they weren't about to sail off the edge of the flat earth. It shows that while dealing with the problems of wind and weather and provisions, the hardest part of the voyage in crossing the Atlantic Ocean was controlling the spirit of his men, the same problems faced by Odysseus at Thrinakia. And Odysseus's men showed that they weren't capable of making a transatlantic voyage. Now, this isn't to say that there wasn't transatlantic commerce, because there was. That's a whole other story, but just not by Odysseus. Jason probably was capable, but not Odysseus. So after they fled the island of Thrinakia, Zeus said the shrieking west wind in a raging tempest and threw a thunderbolt at their ship. The ship whirled around and filled with brimstone and sank, as all of Odysseus's men were thrown from the ship into the waves. So they lost their own lives because of their recklessness. They asked for it. Only Odysseus, who wasn't part of that decision of despair, was able to survive by holding on to a part of the keel of the wrecked ship as he was carried away by the wind. Now, after being borne on the waves for 10 days, he was brought to Ogygia, that Homer calls the flood-circled island where the navel of the sea is. And this is where lived Calypso, who was the daughter of Atlas. Now, if Ogygia was 10 days from Thrinacia, which we assumed was one of the Madeira Islands, we may assume that Ogygia was one of the Azores Islands. Now, you got to see this inset up here. It shows, interestingly, that the Azores Plateau, that's this here, where the Azores Island are, it lies at the triple junction of the North American plate, that's here, this line, with the Eurasian plate, that's this line, and the African plate, right here. So these three plates meet right at the Azores. So I'd think that this would cause a lot of volcanic activity, a lot of earthquakes. And it's interesting, Homer called Ogygia the flood-circled island where the navel of the sea is. Well, that's one of the navels of the sea, I'm convinced. So that's why I say Ogygia is here at the Azores. Now, Calypso, she wished for Odysseus to remain with her there on Ogygia, but Odysseus was not persuaded and wished instead to return home, of which Homer says this.
During the days, sitting upon the rocks and on the beaches, shattering his heart with tears and laments and groans, he kept looking over the barren ocean, shedding tears.
So while Odysseus waited there for 7 long years, right? 7 years in the doldrums. Finally, at the urging of the goddess Athena, Zeus sent his messenger to tell Calypso to allow Odysseus to leave. Calypso instructed Odysseus to build a raft with a mast and sail and with a rudder to steer straight. And Odysseus, ready to bear whatever should happen to him, replied this.
Yet even so I am wishing and longing all my days to go home and to see the day of my return. And if one of the gods wrecks me on the wine-faced sea, I shall bear it in my breast with a long grieving heart. For I have suffered much already and endured much on the waves and in war. And let this be added to those.
Now this is different from his companions, who said they'd rather die quickly of drowning than slowly of starvation. Unlike his men, Odysseus was still hoping, not despairing, and ready to meet his fate, whatever may happen. So he sailed as Calypso had instructed him, watching the Pleiades. The Pleiades was used to show the start of sailing season, and to watch the Boetes and the wagon, which were used to find the North Star. And she said, keeping the North Star on his left, and he sailed east. After 17 days, he finally saw Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. But Poseidon, still angry at Odysseus, stirred up a violent storm against him, breaking the mast, tossing the raft about as he held on, quote, shunning the edge of death. And Odysseus was helped by the goddess Leucothea, and after 3 days, he finally came ashore at Scheria. So if Scheria was 17 days sailing east of Ogygia, we know it's sailing east because he kept the North Star on his left, then we can assume that Scheria is possibly located in the area on the southern coast of Spain. That's where I put it, 17 days east. And Diodorus Siculus writes about this area in Spain when he's describing the Amazons and the Atlanteans. Now, Homer will describe this city of the Phaeacians as an ideal city, a kind of utopia. But some people assume that the Phaeacians were the descendants of the Atlanteans. And so they try to place Atlantis somewhere here on the edge of the ocean, either southern Spain, northern Morocco, or there's a famous book by Ignatius Donnelly where he tries to prove Atlantis was at the Azores. Interesting book. Now, at Scheria, Odysseus met the king, Alcinous, and he attended the assembly of the Phaeacians, who are, quote, famous for ships, as swift as any wing or thought. And Alcinous summoned the singer, Demodocus, of which Homer says this.
The gods have granted him to please beyond others with whatever kind of song his spirit urges him to sing. Then a herald came near, leading the trusty singer, whom the muse loved dearly, and gave both good and ill. She blinded him in the eyes, but gave him a sweet song.
Now, wait a minute. I don't know about you, but I think Homer just placed himself in the story. I think he's Demodocus. And when Demodocus sang tales of the Trojan War, King Alcinous saw that this caused Odysseus to cover his head and shed tears. And so he asked Odysseus this.
Tell me your land and your district and your city, so that ships that are steered by thought may convey you there. For there exist no pilots among the Phaeacians, and there are no rudders at all, such as others have. But the ships themselves know the intentions and minds of man.
Oh, they have quite wonderful ships. There's a whole story about that, which I won't go into. So Odysseus would tell them who he was and where he was from, and then he would tell them of his journey from when he had left Troy until he had arrived there. And after this, Alcinous agreed to send him home. While they sailed in one of the Phaeacian ships, Odysseus fell asleep. And when the ship reached Ithaca, they set him down on the shore while still asleep with his gifts, and they started back homeward before he woke up. Now, after finally returning home and getting rid of the suitors and reunited with his family, there was still one more place where Odysseus had to travel to, as he remembered what Tiresias had told him.
He ordered me to visit many towns of mortals, holding in my hands a well-fitted oar, till the time I come unto those who do not know the sea, and do not eat a food that has been mixed with salt, or about well-fitted oars that are the wings for ships. When another wayfarer has confronted me and said, I had a winnowing fan on my gleaming shoulder, he bade me to fix my oar then into the earth and offer fine sacrifices to Lord Poseidon.
Okay. Sorry about that. Now, when I thought about this scene, it really became most important of all, because Okay, if Odysseus followed this final advice from Tiresias, then those people that he did find, they were far away, probably in a landlocked country, they would ask him, what is that oar? And Odysseus would have to explain to them about ships and about sailing and traveling to other parts of the world, and also about how the world really was. And then they would ask him, why? What's the reason for your traveling? And Odysseus would tell him, well, take a seat. Do I have a story to tell you? A story about an Odyssey. So Homer was showing us that it's not enough to make a discovery, but that it has to be explained or taught, that it has to be passed on to others. And we can see how Homer changes Odysseus from steering his ship to learning how to steer his thoughts. And this is the real purpose of colonization, not subjugating populations to become part of an empire, but sharing in the discoveries of human civilization. Now, it has been said that the ancient Greeks would teach their children to read, to recite, and to memorize Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. What would be the effect on the minds of their youth in being immersed in Homer's ideas? A few generations after Homer, the Greeks began a colonization project along the coasts of Libya and Italy and France, at Cyrene, at Syracuse, at Lipara, at Alalia, at Massalia, and others. I'm just mentioning these because I mentioned them during the talk. And it's also been reported that around the time of the Trojan War, that Greek civilization went into a dark age. Perhaps it was caused by a cultural degeneration, or by invasions and wars, or by catastrophic natural disasters. But it even resulted in the loss of their writing system. It took them hundreds of years before they developed the ability to write again. They took someone else's alphabet. Now, what if that happened to us? What would we do? Become some Mother Earth worshipers, or some believers in magical mysteries, or some anti-science Luddites, you know? Or would we try to discover a way to go forward that would lead to a better understanding of the unknown? And this is an aside. I'm just reminded about, there's a long time ago, back when I used to work for Bell Telephone. That was a while ago. And we had this poster on the wall in our lunchroom that I really used to like looking at. So it was a cartoon about two cavemen. Now, one caveman was down on all fours, and the other was slowly trying to stand up on two legs. And the caveman who was down on all fours looked over at the other guy and yelled, "Hey, get back down here before you hurt yourself." So I really love that poster because it gives you that concept. Now, while today's politically correct oracles of Delphi attack Christopher Columbus, they're trying to tear down his statues and say he is the source of all the evil that befell the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They fail to mention the brutal feudal empires of the British, the French, the Portuguese, and especially the Spanish, and of course their spiritual mother, the Roman Empire, and of their insatiable lust for gold and silver and sugar. And that this idea of empire, the Florentine Renaissance tried to put an end to with their project of discovery that Columbus was a part of. foolishly trying to destroy the discoverer will not put an end to the evils of empire, but rather prolong it. Instead, we should celebrate the discoverer as leading the way towards eliminating tyrants and empires among men. So you know how they say, don't kill the messenger? Maybe we should be saying, don't kill the discoverer, so that we don't overlook this idea of the individual discoverer. In opposition to the materialist attempts at history, attempts that take the individual's discovery out of the picture, which is so wrong, because it's the individual that makes the discoveries, and it's the individual that makes history. The individual discoverer isn't a victim of fate, but can decide the direction that he or she goes in, not going with whatever way the wind blows. And that brings us back to the north wind, Homer's metaphor of the north wind that changed Odysseus' course, that began his Odyssey and later steered him to Hades. And whether it led to more troubles or was a solution to his troubles. So I was thinking, what if Homer hadn't lost his sight? Would he still have turned his talent to poetry? Would we still have an Odyssey? I like to think that it wouldn't have mattered to him. We would have it. But what if fate gave us an obstacle that blew us off course? Would we act like Odysseus' companions? Or instead, would we be like Odysseus and let our muse show us how to steer our thoughts to try to effect a new discovery? Homer may be telling us that we shouldn't take things so literally, so formally. We should rely more on our imagination and our creativity to help us find that enthusiasm that we read about in Keats's poem. Remember on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Now, I want to bring back Keats and read another funny little poem that he wrote. It was part of a letter that he wrote to his sister, Fanny. He was talking about his walking tour. He took a walking tour to Scotland to visit the birthplace of Robert Burns. So right in the middle of this letter to his sister, he starts writing a poem about it, just right off the top of his head. So this is the last stanza from that doggerel poem in the letter. I just want to read it because I like it so much. So there was a naughty boy, and a naughty boy was he. He ran away to Scotland, the people for to see. Then he found that the ground was as hard, that a yard was as long, that a song was as merry, that a cherry was as red, that lead was as weighty, that 80 was as 80, that a door was as wooden as in England. So he stood in his shoes and he wondered. He wondered. He stood in his shoes and he wondered. It's so funny. Now, by simply changing one letter, changing an A into an O, by changing the word wander into wonder, a voyage of discovery of things becomes a voyage of discovery of ideas. So I hope that I've been able to show this poetic method of Homer in writing his Odyssey. And as Strabo said, how Homer gilded history with the beauties of fancy. And I think Keats would agree. I just want to quote him once more from another poem of his. Ever let the fancy roam. Pleasure never is at home. At a touch, sweet pleasure melteth, like to bubbles when rain pelteth. Then let winged fancy wander through the thoughts still spread beyond her. Open wide the mind's cage door, and she'll dart forth and cloudward soar. And that's just the first 8 lines of the poem. I'm going to let you read the rest of it on your own. That's your homework for tonight. So in closing, perhaps reading Homer's Odyssey or Apollonius's Argonautica or Washington Irving's Life of Columbus could inspire us to continue to try to discover these beauties of fancy that we find in that poem of the universe. And maybe the next time we see a morning sunrise, we'll think of Homer and those rosy fingers of dawn. So I'm going to end it there. And I think we'll open it up for any questions or comments or criticisms. Let me have to unshare, I think.
You got it. Jerry, that was great.
Okay.
There was a lot of wonderful ideas. I think Homer would be very proud that his memory was being evoked in this particular way. It was very refreshing. I have some questions, but I'm going to leave that aside for now. I saw John got in, and there's somebody who's had their hand up for a while as well.
Okay.
Who is this person here? Sorry. Well, let's ask John, because I don't know the name of the other person first. So John, what's your question?
I have a comment for people who are interested in early adventures crossing the oceans. My neighbor Gunnar Thompson wrote along several books, maybe 6 or 8, and includes on Marco Polo. He thinks that Marco Polo went to the west coast of America. He has stuff on Drake and Zheng He and the Sinclairs exploring the Americas, and it's quite interesting. But a special note, his book on the Mayans includes the art and how the Mayan art progressed as the Chinese art progressed. And he can show the evolution in the art as it evolved in China and in the Mayan kingdom. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Jerry, was have you seen Julian Jaynes' breakdown of the bicameral mind?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, if you're a fan of Odysseus, it's pretty interesting. His idea was that in the Iliad, all of the characters are motivated.
Oh, no, hey, John, we lost you there. You went on mute.
Oh, okay. So before that, the mind was, the 2 hemispheres of the mind were separate. And so during times of high stress, they connected, and people experienced that as the voices of the gods. So they were actually experiencing a kind of possession by the gods. So when they talk of the wrath of the Achilles, that's actually a type of possession that he experienced. But he says that Odysseus is one of the first people where the 2 halves of the mind were connected. And so he actually had a personal narrative, which people didn't have before that. And he was canny. He was able to trick the gods. And so it was just an interesting change in the development of thought.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a lot there. Ooh. But there's a lot of books been written about, the connections between different civilizations, and it should be obvious that there was commerce between continents. There's certain definite proof, but I had written something just, if the first human, they call it Lucy, 2.5 million years ago, surely over 2.4 million years, man would have spread to every corner of the entire planet. So by 100,000 years ago, man was everywhere. So there had to have been certain cultural connections. Some may have been lost, some new ones, but to deny that is really denying human history. And I think that that's the main point I just wanted to make with that. And I'm not familiar with that book, Julian James, so I'll have to check that out, John. Thanks very much.
And thanks for a great lecture.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
All right, we got the hand up that's been there for a very long time, belongs to Greg. Greg, if you're still there, you can pose your question.
No, I thought I pulled that. That was a mistake.
Oh, okay. All right, not to worry.
Okay. You can ask a question anyway.
Well, I have I had a few questions. The thought that really struck me at the end, which is jarring a little bit when you consider how Greece lost its written language when it went into that complete corruption and decline into a dark age that Homer was able to pull that society out of. Not me, not personally, but I mean, you did a great job getting it at his role in bringing about a new Renaissance. Just today, when you look at the type of thinking where schools have purged the teaching of cursive writing. So young people today don't know how to read the original writings or letters. If they wanted to do research on archival work from either their own family or deeper history, they can't even do it because they don't know what they're looking at. And increasingly, there's just these symbols everywhere. You're using, even when you want to do something as simple as a copy paste, they got rid of the word. They're getting rid of the word copy and paste, and they're just having symbols. So yeah, it's very jarring to think what type of trajectory especially the young are on, let alone the fact that the quality of ideas, the mental infrastructure to hold heavy ideas in the mind is really weak. That's unto itself. But so the parallel to today's warning is very strong. The question though that I had dealt with something that you said at the very beginning when you brought up the Rembrandt painting regarding Virgil contemplating the bust of Homer. And this might be maybe a bit more trivial of a question, but it really was something I wanted to just throw out there. I had always confronted the idea that it was Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer, and you were the first person who ever introduced to me the idea that it might not be Aristotle at all, but more likely Virgil. And so I thought it was proven, and I looked into it, and sure enough, it was not proven at all. It was never proven. It's all just people speculating, who it might be. But Virgil seems to be a pretty strong one, and what you've said indicates that you've really thought about this. Could you say a little bit more how you came to the conclusion that Virgil was this timocratic being that had sight but couldn't see compared to Homer? Could you say anything more about that?
Oh, I could talk for another hour, but I don't think people will want me to. I'll try to be short, but as you can see, I love Homer and I really hate Virgil. I can't stand reading his. So for me, this painting was just so obvious. Now, you got to know who Virgil was. So Virgil lived from 70 BC to 19 BC. Okay, so right around the beginnings of the Roman Empire. So Virgil was commissioned. He was paid by Caesar Augustus to write an epic about Rome, right? Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the Roman Empire, to give it legitimacy. And Virgil spent about 10 years writing it before he died. In the end, he takes the, is that Warfield? Hi. He's interested too. So he goes back to the War of Troy. But Virgil sides with not the Greeks, the Trojans. And so Aeneas somehow was able to escape from Troy, and he made it with his family to Rome and beat up the people that lived there and then established Rome. And that's how we got the Roman Empire. that he tries to say it's directly connected to the Trojans, which is all crap. He made the whole thing up. So he never in his book, the Aeneid, which he gets the ideas to start it from Homer in his Iliad, he doesn't mention Homer once in the whole book. Homer to him doesn't exist. Okay, how does he describe Odysseus? Odysseus, here I got it right. Odysseus is a heartless schemer, a master craftsman of crime. He's double talking. He really hates Odysseus. I mean, I read the Odyssey. I thought Odysseus was the one guy who actually changed, but Virgil just hates him. And so you have this problem that you see it with Dante. Dante never read Homer. They didn't translate Homer from Greek into Latin until about 20, 30 years after Dante had died. So he had to rely on Virgil to get an idea of Odysseus. And if you've read Dante's Divine Comedy, he puts Odysseus in hell. He is not a fan of Odysseus. But Dante, brilliant as he was, he had Virgil leading him, through hell, purgatory. Sorry, Virgil, you can't go into paradise. You can't. So he understood the flaw in Virgil, even though he had never read Homer. He knew it. I wish he had been able to read Homer. And, well, I tell you, the Divine Comedy would be totally different. But to see that in Dante, where he understood that conflict in Virgil, listening to all these classes on Rising Tide and our Wednesday evening club, the way Dr. Quan Le talks about, the aristocratic man, the timocratic man, when he said that, I just said, that is Virgil. He's in both worlds. He's got one hand on Homer's head. He's trying to figure out, how did he do it? I got to understand how to write poetry. But, he's got the other hand on his gold saying, well, you know what? I'm being paid by the Roman Empire here. I can't really go out on a limb against them. So for me, seeing that painting, it was there. Aristotle, well, you could use it in the same way to show the difference between the thinking of Aristotle and Homer, but there's no story. With Virgil and Homer, right? What are we taught in school? Oh, you want to learn Greek and Latin classics. No, you don't. You want to learn the Greek classic. Take all these Latin classics, throw them in the garbage. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing there. There's not one thing that the Roman Empire did to advance civilization, except ideas they stole from everyone else that they conquered. But we want Greco-Roman architecture. We want Greek and Roman literature. So for me, that painting says it all. He's got one hand on Homer's head, one hand on his wallet. And that's the timocratic man.
No, that's fantastic. That's exactly what I was hungry for. And Jerry, if you want to compose into a written word that argument, we would love to publish that on Rising Tide in a split second. I've never seen it put the way you just did. That's great. Really good.
I'd try to write it if I didn't get so emotionally upset about it, but I will try. Yeah. I definitely will try. But you can see why I hate Virgil.
It's more clear now.
Yeah.
All right.
There's no soul. There's no soul. It's like Quan says. He knows that man should be honorable, but you just want the appearance to look. It's like our politicians today, right? Mm-hmm. You have to appear to be honorable. You don't have to be honorable, right? You got that,
You're saying like there's nothing analogous to the quality of transformation of a character from lesser to better as you see it in Homer. You don't see that, is what you're saying, in Virgil's writings. It's about the veneer behavior.
No, it's yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's
interesting.
It's to give an excuse to the Roman Empire. for its existence. We're from Troy. We have a, this is our myth. We can, it's not, it's, anyway.
Matt, may I have 1 minute?
May we?
Oh, Dr. Kwan, yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Just to go in the sense of your speech, Jerry, I think that precisely that painting is extraordinary because it shows the inner struggle of man in the space between the lower trigram, is I use the vocabulary of the I Ching, and the upper trigram. I would say that it's always a fight, and the victory of the upper trigram, meaning truth, goodness, and beauty, is never certain. But in each life, at each generation, there is also the possibility of the victory of truth, goodness, and beauty. And each time that the upper trigram wins, the impact in the future generations would be enormous compared to the often failures of the upper trigram. But that's universal history precisely.
Mhm.
Because if the upper trigram wins too fast, it would be not fun. There would be no history, no tragedy.
Yes. Yes. I know. I sometimes think of myself that way. I have one foot in the lower trigram and the other foot in the upper trigram, and you're constantly trying to improve yourself to get into the upper trigram and the ideas of beauty and truth. And yes, I think most of us are like that too, are trying. I don't know if Virgil made it, but I don't think he did, but he was trying. You see the attempt, that's what I was trying to show. The Timocratic man, the attempt to change, but I don't think he did. I try to improve, but yes, I like your way of describing that. It's one of the ideas from you I stole, Kwan.
Oh, I stole it from others, so don't worry.
Certainly our art and poetry would be a lot more, I think, boring if we were all born with enlightenment and we didn't have to struggle.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to have that struggle or you won't, you'll never do it. You'll never reach the upper trigram. You have to be struggling to get there, to try to figure out what is it that we need to develop in others where they can see that upper trigram. Another way I look at it, this is an aside, is, when you're reading Plato or you're reading Mencius, you see the same thing, not just in terms of people, but in terms of culture. How does one culture actually improve and develop? And on the other hand, you have cultures that have degenerated. What happened? Plato talks about it with Atlantis. It used to be a very advanced culture, and then it slowly deteriorated. And you try to see what is in our government, what is in, our managers of politics that allows for either, movement towards the upper trigram, or what gives us movement towards the lower trigram. So I see it not just as individuals, but as like countries, as cultures too. You have anything to add on that, Kwan?
Well, I would say that to go back to an article by Cynthia discussing precisely that fight between the upper and the lower trigrams, or taking the example of Greece and Rome precisely. And she was speaking of the whims of fate, and the only way to win against the whims of fate precisely is to develop valor and wisdom, the upper trigram precisely. And that's, I would say, the temporal dimension, the whims of fate, and the valor and wisdom would be the eternal or the divine dimension. And I would say that we human beings, we are the field of battle between those two dimensions, and that's makes us unique, because contrary to the other animals, that inner battle doesn't happen in other animals. It's only in us that inner battle is happening.
Yes, very good. I like that. Mhm.
Mhm. With that, I don't see any more questions in the queue. So if anybody has something that they want to get off their chest now, it's now or never. To ask Jerry a question or throw a thought out there.
Last call.
Jerry, hi.
Bonjour.
I was. It was very interesting how you presented it, and I was anticipating it a bit the way I know you organize your lectures. And it was great. I liked the when you discussed the Trojan War and how, you know, based on Homer, on the work of Homer, Schliemann, was it Heinrich Schliemann?
Heinrich Schliemann, yeah.
Right, was able to actually rediscover the city of Troy, actually the many cities of Troy, and it's something that I know we discussed also during the reading our reading the reading we do during the week. But this question of how art sometimes, you know, bringing more truths in a sense, you know, like the quotes that you gave on how it was composed, the Stroba quote on how, you know, it's based on truth. You know, it's obviously the poetry is there to embellish the whole thing and create new figures and style, but that it's based on truth. And I thought that was a very good example of how, you know, if you want to actually communicate a higher truth, you need poetry. You need that kind of medium. So I really appreciated that, and I knew you would do it. So thank you.
Oh yeah. No, I really like that quote from Strabo. When I saw it, I said that's what I think about Homer too. You take historical events, but you have to use poetry to elevate them, and also to be able to explain it to others, like, you know, that he does at the end of the Odyssey, where Odysseus has to go and find someone who doesn't know what an oar is and explain it to him. You know, it's you can't be formal and in describing it. Poetry is able to access, you know, your soul, to access ideas. It's not a question of showing them, oh, this is where this is, that's where that is, and that's where that is. No, but yes, I really liked that quote by Strabo. It was very insightful on his part.
Okay. Any last takers here?
Yes, Jerry, this is Monty in Baja, Mexico, and
Ooh,
very fascinating journey you took me on. I'm quite enthralled with it. And your comment on Columbus keeping two sets of books, it just happened to remind me of Eratosthenes had, I think, 3rd century BC, actually measured the distance around the world. And it's my understanding that Columbus actually had maps, but the positioning of India was way off because presumably the Venetians drastically increased their distance as far as the length of the Silk Road to dissuade other travelers from going there. So to this day, just based on this fallacy that was picked up. The Indians in America are known as Indians. I just always find that quite fascinating.
Yes. Yes, that was Marco Polo that fudged the distance to the Orient from Europe, and that's why the distances were all off. They were relying on Marco Polo. But yeah, it's but it's also interesting that if you look at, I talk a lot about Jason and the Argonauts. Now, his voyage was like, maybe a couple hundred years before the Trojan War, but it wasn't really put into a poem until Apollonius, during the 200 BCs. Now, he wrote the poem on Jason and the Argonauts, which is another masterpiece too. Now, Apollonius, he went to the library at Alexandria and he studied poetry under Callimachus. Callimachus did a lot of stuff at the library. The one thing I like, he wrote that poem, they told me Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. That's Callimachus. So then after Apollonius, who wrote Jason and the Argonauts, he became head of the library of Alexandria. So he's not just some nobody. This guy was head of the library. And after him, the next head of the library was Eratosthenes. And then, so it's like you have Homer writes the Odyssey, and a few centuries later, the Greeks are starting this colonization project. Then you have Apollonius, who writes Argonautica, Jason and the Argonauts, and the next generation around Eratosthenes is measuring the circumference of the world and launching projects of discoveries all over the place. And there's a whole write-up about the work they were doing, but it's almost like you need this artist to give people a kick in the butt to get going. So there's a real connection between Homer and Apollonius and the school of the Library of Alexandria too. It's all connected. So I
got to just take this question. I have to throw a question at you, Jerry, because you just brought it up. And I had read that Eratosthenes had also organized a colonization project of sorts with the Egyptians through the Pacific and into Hawaii and the regions of even South America that we have evidence for. And I was wondering if you had any knowledge that you have looked at that corroborates that or puts a little bit more meat onto the bones of that hypothesis. Is that something you've looked at?
Yes, that's a whole other class. You have to go to Hawaii. And the fellow just died last year, Babayan, who circumnavigated the planet in a native raft from Hawaii around the whole. They actually came to Canada. They came up the Hudson River. This was 2015. But yes, you can look at the Eratosthenes and their attempts to explore Asia. There is evidence, markings, I think, what's his name, of him reaching as far as Australia. And from there, you can see the seafaring peoples who moved into all the islands in the Pacific. But yeah, there's a lot of proof. Even, oh God, do I have time to go into this? I guess so. Okay, here's something that blew me away. So you're talking about Mediterranean. Don't talk about Europe. It's Mediterranean culture. It's all one culture. It's not Europe, Asia, Libya. So you have European culture and you have America. So back in 1985, off the coast of Turkey, they find this shipwreck. So they're digging it up and they find these copper bars. Oh, okay. Now, these copper bars, they dated the wreck, carbon dating to about 1300 BC. So it's before the Trojan War, 1300 BC. And they have these copper bars, and the copper is like 99% pure copper. Now, they didn't have the technology in 1300 BC to smelt copper to make it, 99% pure. But there is one place on planet Earth where you can find copper on the ground right there that's 99% pure copper. And that's in Lake Superior, northern Michigan. So they went to, there's about 5,000 of these old ancient mines, northern Michigan. So they did a carbon dating of these mines. And the earliest ones were about, say, 2500 BC, which is the same time they're building the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And then all of a sudden, around 1200 BC, they just stopped. That's it. Nothing after that. So for like 1,000 years or so, copper was being taken out of the mines in Michigan. And where did it go? Well, they found it in Turkey. How does it get there? So there was transatlantic commerce between, Europe, Mediterranean civilization at that time. Egypt would be the center of, because they were so advanced building the pyramids. So somehow you got the copper, came down the Mississippi, across the ocean, and got it to Egypt, 2500 BC. And then after 1200, nothing. So that corresponds to the Dark Age in Greece, that after the Trojan War, there's this Dark Age. They forgot how to go to the Americas. They didn't figure it out again until Columbus. That's a long time to go, but you actually have proof like that. There's no other way you can explain 1300 BC, 99% copper. It has to come from Lake Superior. It had to. There's no other place. So there's other evidence like that, but people don't want to believe it. They don't want to believe that people were that smart. Well, they don't want to believe that we're this smart. They want us to be stupid. Our children are born geniuses, and then we teach them how to be stupid, so they won't challenge the empire, But I just wanted to make that point about the copper. It proved the whole point to me. I was saying, okay, that's it. So there has to have been, transoceanic travel going way back. And, like where you look, if Atlantis was at the Azores, and it's right there at the merging of these three plates, holy moly, you're going to have a lot of activity there. So it's possible Atlantis could have been there and got wiped out by some, natural event, plates moving and that. It's possible. So, yeah. I could talk about this for days, Matt.
I think we're gonna have to commission you for another follow-up very soon. And based on what you've just said too, I'm just making a mental note here, and for anybody listening online or here in the audience, I'm gonna include a link in the description of this video when it's uploaded online to a really good documentary that Dr. Le did a review of, that we published on the I think it's called The Secret of the Pyramids. And there's a lot of documentaries about the pyramids that are out there, and a lot of books, countless. But this one really stands out, and it provides, I found, the most rigorous, responsible, rational approach. Yeah, K 2019. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
To this from a variety of angles, and also just demonstrates the best evidence, at least, of the international commerce and intercivilizational connections of the new so-called New World and Old World. We have to sort of redefine what New World means, actually, after watching that. So I'll put that there for people to check out, and it'll really, really shape a good gestalt. I think with that, I mean, It's a little after 4 o'clock our Eastern Standard Time right now. I don't know. I guess we have time for one more question. I see, Scott, you're really active here in the chat area. Did you want to pose a question, or do you want to just leave those as chat texts? Scott?
Where's Scott?
I see evidence of his existence. Okay. All right. You know what? I think this is a really great place to stop. And I think that this sets the stage really nicely to next week's lecture by Dr. Liu, which will tackle some ancient Chinese myths, philosophy, history, stories, and also a certain tale of the three kingdoms, which has some interesting insights that it gives us into not only China's history, but human nature as well. So that'll be next Sunday at 2 p.m. And I hope everyone can jump back on and also let your friends know. If you got people who love ideas in your network, feel free to pass on the Zoom link and bring them in. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your Sunday with us. And thank you, Jerry, for sharing your ideas with us.